When the Civil War ended in 1865, freedom finally reached the millions who had lived their entire lives in bondage. Across the American South, the word emancipation echoed through fields and towns. Families reunited, children once sold away were found, and churches filled with songs of hope. For the first time, a new future seemed possible. Yet beneath the surface of that promise, another reality was already taking shape, one that would trap generations of Black Americans in a different kind of cage. The plantation owners, politicians, and businessmen who had once depended on slavery were unwilling to accept a world of equality. So they found another way to maintain control. Through a series of laws, local ordinances, and unwritten rules, they began to rebuild a social order that looked alarmingly familiar. These laws would later be known as Jim Crow. They did not rely on whips and chains, but on words and statutes, crafted carefully to separate, to silence, and to remind every Black citizen that freedom had limits. In many towns, new signs appeared almost overnight: white only, colored entrance, no Negroes allowed. Train cars, schools, restaurants, hospitals, even cemeteries, were divided by race. The phrase, separate but equal, became the official justification, but everyone knew there was nothing equal about it. The best schools, the safest neighborhoods, and the highest wages belonged to one side of the color line. On the other stood millions, still fighting for dignity and a place in their own country. What makes this chapter of history so haunting is not only the cruelty of the laws themselves, but the way they were accepted as normal for decades. It was a system so ordinary that it could hide in plain sight, a world where injustice wore the mask of order. This is the story of how America, after ending slavery, created a new system of control that would shape lives for nearly a century. It is a story of pain, but also of resistance and hope, as countless men and women stood against impossible odds to demand the freedom they had already been promised. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep history alive, and learn from it. In the final years of the 19th century, America stood at a crossroads. The promise of freedom after the Civil War had begun to fade into something far more complicated. Reconstruction had offered a glimpse of progress: Black men voting, holding office, building schools, and creating communities rooted in hope. But as the old power structures returned, so too did a quiet determination among Southern lawmakers to restore the racial hierarchy that slavery had once enforced. It was in this atmosphere that a man named Homer Plessy stepped onto a train in New Orleans in 1892. He was 7/8 white and 1/8 Black, a man whose skin could easily pass in the world reserved for white citizens. Yet by the laws of Louisiana, that single fraction of ancestry meant he was considered colored. When Plessy sat in a whites-only car and refused to move, he was arrested. His act was deliberate, a planned challenge to the laws of segregation. But what began as a local protest would soon shape the nation for decades to come. The case that followed, known as Plessy v. Ferguson, reached the United States Supreme Court in 1896. The question before the justices was simple yet profound: could a state enforce racial separation under the guise of equality? The court's decision would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. In a 7-1 ruling, the court declared that segregation was constitutional, as long as the facilities provided for both races were separate but equal. In that moment, the illusion of fairness was born. On paper, the ruling claimed that separation did not mean inferiority. In practice, it legalized a system of deep and lasting inequality. Across the South, equal meant dilapidated schoolhouses, outdated textbooks, and overcrowded classrooms for Black children. Hospitals lacked proper equipment and trained staff. Public libraries had limited hours or no access at all. Even parks, theaters, and restrooms carried the mark of division, each one a reminder of who was considered worthy and who was not. This ruling did more than divide physical spaces, it divided the soul of a nation. Segregation was now the law of the land, and its defenders hid behind the words of the Supreme Court as if those words were sacred. Separate but equal became a shield for injustice, a phrase repeated so often that it began to sound reasonable to those who never had to feel its sting. For the black communities living under this system, survival required both resilience and creativity. They built their own schools, trained their own teachers, and formed institutions that would nurture generations of thinkers, artists, and leaders. Yet the burden was immense. Tax dollars flowed toward white institutions, leaving black facilities to rely on scraps. Children studied under leaking roofs, doctors treated patients with worn-out tools, and families were told to be patient, as if equality were a dream that could wait. One justice, John Marshall Harlan, stood alone in dissent. He warned that the decision would become as infamous as the Dred Scott ruling decades earlier. In his words, the Constitution was meant to be colorblind, and the United States had no caste system. But his voice was only one among many, and his warning went unheeded. For nearly 6 decades, Plessy v. Ferguson remained the law, shaping every corner of American life. It would take generations of struggle, countless acts of courage, and the tireless efforts of civil rights activists before the illusion of separate but equal was finally torn apart. But in 1896, when the gavel fell, a new kind of wall rose between Americans, a wall not made of stone, but of laws, fear, and silence. At the end of the 19th century, the ballot box became the new battleground. After the Civil War, the right to vote had symbolized something sacred, a promise that every man, regardless of color, had a voice in shaping his country's future. For a brief moment, that promise was real. Black voters filled registration lists, elected representatives, and influenced laws that began to rebuild the South on fairer terms. But for those who still longed for the old order, this newfound power was intolerable. One by one, Southern legislatures began to rewrite their constitutions. They no longer needed chains or whips, now, they had pens and ink. The goal was simple: to strip away the political power of black citizens without ever admitting it aloud. On the surface, these laws seemed harmless, even bureaucratic. But beneath their polite language lay a ruthless intent to silence millions. The first barrier came in the form of the poll tax. A few dollars might not seem much, but for laborers earning only cents a day, it was a wall too high to climb. Paying the tax was often required months before an election, meaning that those living day to day could easily miss the deadline. The result was predictable: thousands of black voters were quietly erased from the rolls, not by violence but by paperwork. Then came the literacy tests. Officials claimed they were meant to ensure an informed electorate, but the tests were designed to fail. One man might be asked to read a simple line from the state constitution, while another, usually a black applicant, was handed an entire passage written in legal jargon or Latin. The examiner's word was final. No appeal, no fairness, no second chance. Some were asked absurd questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Questions with no answer but one message: you do not belong here. To make sure poor white voters weren't caught in the same net, lawmakers added what they called the grandfather clause. It allowed anyone to vote if their father or grandfather had been eligible before the Civil War. For white families, this opened the door wide. For black families, whose ancestors had been denied every right of citizenship, the door slammed shut. By the early 1900s, the transformation was complete. In Mississippi, black voter registration plummeted from more than 100,000 to barely 1,000 in just a few years. Similar decline spread across the South like a shadow. Polling places that had once been full of life grew silent. Ballots that could have shaped history were never cast. This quiet disenfranchisement was one of the most effective tools of control in American history. It required no public violence, no spectacle, only a series of signatures and seals that carried the weight of law. It told black citizens that the country which had freed them still would not trust them with its future. Yet even in the face of erasure, resistance endured. Community leaders organized secret voter education classes, churches collected money to help pay poll taxes, and activists risked everything to challenge these laws in court. Though victories came slowly, they never stopped trying to reclaim the voice that had been stolen. What began as lines on paper would take nearly 70 years to undo. Only with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, would the barriers built during the Jim Crow era begin to crumble. But for generations, the promise of democracy had been reduced to a whisper, drowned out by the machinery of discrimination disguised as law. In the world of Jim Crow, the courtroom was not a place of justice, it was a stage where the outcome was often decided long before the trial began. The ideals carved above courthouse doors, truth, fairness, equality before the law, were hollow promises for many. For black citizens in the early 20th century South, the law did not serve as a shield, it was often the weapon used against them. From the moment an accusation was made, the odds were set. A whisper, a rumor, or the word of a single white witness could lead to arrest without question. Police officers, sworn to protect, frequently acted as enforcers of the racial order. Their uniforms gave legitimacy to the injustices that followed. Black defendants were led into courtrooms in chains, surrounded by hostility, while outside, crowds gathered, certain of the verdict before a single word was spoken. Inside those courtrooms, the juries told the rest of the story. All white, all male, and drawn from voter lists that excluded black citizens, these juries represented only one side of the community. Their judgments reflected the world they knew, a world where the color of a man's skin was enough to determine his guilt. Defense lawyers, if they were provided at all, often faced threats for representing their clients too well. Some cases lasted mere hours, others, only minutes. The sentence, whether prison, labor, or worse, was swift and predictable. The law itself was written in ways that ensured inequality. Crimes were punished differently depending on who committed them and against whom. A white man's accusation could outweigh a black man's testimony, no matter the evidence. In some places, it was illegal for black witnesses to testify against white defendants. Even when innocence was clear, appeals were dismissed, evidence ignored, and justice delayed until it was meaningless. There were stories whispered in every town, of men taken from jail cells by masked figures before sunrise, of verdicts delivered under pressure from angry mobs waiting outside the courthouse doors. Local authorities often looked the other way or claimed helplessness, their silence granting approval. To live in that system was to understand that the law did not belong to everyone. And yet, despite the overwhelming power of this machinery, there were those who refused to be silent. Black lawyers, ministers, and community leaders began documenting each injustice, sending reports to northern newspapers and civil rights organizations. They knew that the truth had to be seen and heard beyond the reach of those who wanted to bury it. Groups like the NAACP emerged from this determination, challenging the idea that the law was untouchable. Some judges, too, began to question the system they served. A few dared to issue rulings that recognized the humanity of those brought before them, though they often faced fierce backlash for it. These moments were rare, but they planted seeds of change that would one day grow into movements for civil rights and equality. Still, for decades, the courthouse remained a place of fear. Its steps were not a path to justice but a reminder of how deeply inequality had been woven into the nation's institutions. Each trial, each sentence, each silence left a scar that would take generations to heal. The story of these courts is not just one of corruption or cruelty, it is a warning. It shows how laws, when twisted by prejudice, can turn from instruments of protection into tools of oppression. It reminds us that justice is fragile, and that when it bends toward power instead of truth, entire communities can lose faith in the very idea of fairness. When the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was ratified, America celebrated the formal end of slavery. The amendment declared that no one could be enslaved, except as punishment for a crime. It was a short phrase, tucked quietly into the nation's defining promise of freedom, but that small exception would open a door that many were eager to walk through. In the years that followed, the South faced an economic crisis. Plantations lay in ruins, labor was scarce, and the wealth once built on the backs of enslaved people had vanished. But where others saw loss, state officials and businessmen saw opportunity. They discovered that through the justice system, they could rebuild their fortunes without ever calling it slavery again. It began with laws known as the Black Codes. These laws made ordinary life for newly freed men and women nearly impossible. A person could be arrested for vagrancy if they didn't have proof of employment, fined for loitering if they stood on a street corner too long, or jailed for breaking curfews that applied only to them. Once convicted, even for the smallest offense, they became property of the state. And the state, in turn, leased them to private companies for profit. Railroad tycoons, mine owners, and plantation operators lined up to take advantage. They paid the government a small fee for the use of prisoners, who were then forced into grueling labor. The men, mostly young and poor, worked in mines so dark and dangerous that many never came out. Others laid railroad tracks through swamps and forests, chained together under the burning sun. In theory, they were serving legal sentences. In reality, it was slavery reborn under another name. The conditions were unspeakable. There was little food, no medical care, and no protection from the overseers who drove them to exhaustion. If a man collapsed, he was often left behind. If he resisted, he could be beaten or worse, with no record ever made of his suffering. Prisoners were considered replaceable. When one died, another was sent to take his place. The system was efficient, profitable, and utterly dehumanizing. Southern states quickly realized how valuable this arrangement was. The profits filled state coffers, funded public projects, and rebuilt industries. Convict leasing became one of the cornerstones of the post-war economy. It provided free labor on a massive scale, just as slavery once had, while allowing those in power to claim they were merely enforcing the law. For the men trapped within it, there was no escape. Trials were often rushed, evidence ignored, and sentences extended for arbitrary reasons. Once inside the system, even the smallest infraction could add years to a sentence. Families might wait for word that never came, unaware that their sons and fathers had been sent to distant camps or mines where the life expectancy was heartbreakingly short. Reformers and journalists eventually began to expose the truth. Reports of brutality and death emerged from across the South, describing conditions so harsh that even some supporters of the system began to recoil. Activists demanded an end to convict leasing, arguing that it violated the very spirit of freedom the nation claimed to uphold. By the early 20th century, some states began to abolish the practice, but others simply replaced it with chain gangs, public labor crews that carried on much of the same exploitation under a different name. The system's shadow lingered for decades, shaping the relationship between race, law, and labor in America. The story of convict leasing is not just a chapter in the history of injustice, it is a reflection of how power adapts. When one system of control fell, another rose to take its place, built upon the same foundations of greed and inequality. It serves as a reminder that freedom, once promised, must be defended, not just in law, but in the reality of how that law is lived. In the years following World War I, the United States stood on the edge of transformation. The nation had sent its young men overseas to fight for freedom and democracy, and many of them returned home with medals, and with hope. Among them were thousands of black soldiers who had served bravely in uniform, believing that their sacrifice would earn them a fuller share of the liberty they had defended abroad. But when they came home, they found that the battle for equality was far from over. In cities and towns across the country, tensions simmered. The war had changed the economy, factories were booming, jobs were scarce, and returning soldiers of all races competed for work. Meanwhile, black families who had migrated north in search of opportunity were building neighborhoods filled with businesses, churches, and schools. For the first time, prosperity and pride were beginning to take root in places where, for generations, survival had been the only goal. To those invested in the old order, this progress was seen not as success, but as a threat. The sight of black-owned banks, theaters, and grocery stores challenged the myth that had long justified segregation. Whispers of resentment turned to open hostility, and in the summer of 1919, violence erupted on an unprecedented scale. That year would be remembered as the Red Summer, a season marked by dozens of violent attacks across the United States. In Washington, D.C., Chicago, and smaller towns from Arkansas to Nebraska, white mobs stormed into black neighborhoods, burning homes and destroying businesses. Many of these assaults began with rumors or fabricated accusations, but beneath them all lay the same motive: to remind an emerging generation of black Americans that their success had limits. In Chicago, a black teenager named Eugene Williams was killed after drifting into a whites-only section of Lake Michigan. When police refused to arrest those responsible, days of chaos followed. Homes were set ablaze, families fled through smoke-filled streets, and the National Guard was eventually called in to restore order. By the time it ended, dozens were dead, hundreds injured, and entire neighborhoods reduced to ashes. Just 2 years later, the violence reached its most devastating expression in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District, known proudly as Black Wall Street, was one of the most prosperous black communities in America. It had doctors, lawyers, banks, schools, and elegant homes, a symbol of what freedom and determination could achieve. But in May 1921, a false accusation against a young black man ignited a fury that spread faster than anyone could stop it. Over the course of 2 days, mobs stormed Greenwood. Airplanes dropped incendiaries from above while armed groups looted and burned from the ground. Churches, hospitals, and businesses were destroyed. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 1,000 homes lay in ruins, and the community that had taken decades to build was gone. Survivors were herded into makeshift detention centers, and insurance companies refused to pay claims for the destruction. What made these events so tragic was not only the scale of the violence, but the silence that followed. Newspapers buried the stories, officials looked the other way, and history books omitted the truth for generations. The survivors carried their memories quietly, passing them down in whispers so that their children would know what had been lost, and what it had cost to build it in the first place. The Red Summer and the Tulsa Massacre were not isolated tragedies, they were part of a broader attempt to control the pace of progress. Each act of destruction was meant to send a message, that prosperity and equality could be challenged by force. Yet, even amid the ashes, resilience endured. Families rebuilt, churches reopened, and voices rose again, determined to keep alive the dream that no amount of violence could extinguish. When the Supreme Court handed down its decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, it was meant to mark a new beginning. The ruling declared that separate but equal had no place in public education, and that segregation in schools violated the Constitution. For millions of families, it sounded like a long-awaited victory, the first real step toward equal opportunity. Yet, across much of the South, those words on paper met fierce resistance. Some governors vowed open defiance, districts closed their schools entirely, and new policies were crafted to delay integration for as long as possible. Change, once promised, would not come easily. In Arkansas, that resistance would be tested in a way that captured the attention of the entire nation. The city of Little Rock became the setting for one of the most defining confrontations of the civil rights era. The year was 1957, and Central High School, an imposing building of brick and marble, stood as both a symbol of modern education and a fortress of segregation. 9 black students had been selected to attend the all-white school, each of them chosen for their academic excellence and quiet strength. They were teenagers, but what they were about to face would demand the courage of seasoned soldiers. On the morning of September 4th, the Little Rock Nine approached the school for the first time. They were met not by welcoming teachers or classmates, but by a wall of soldiers from the Arkansas National Guard. Governor Orville Faubus had ordered them to block the students' entry, claiming it was for their own safety. Behind the soldiers, an angry crowd gathered, jeering, shouting, and waving signs filled with hatred. Among the 9 was 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford, who arrived alone that morning, unaware that the others had planned to walk together. Surrounded by hostility, she tried to reach the school's doors but was turned away by the guards. The image of her standing alone, clutching her books while the mob screamed behind her, would become one of the most powerful photographs of the century. For weeks, the confrontation escalated. The state government and the federal government clashed over who held authority. Finally, President Dwight D. Eisenhower intervened. In an extraordinary move, he sent federal troops from the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students into Central High. When the soldiers arrived, they formed protective lines around the 9 teenagers as they walked through the gates, silent, proud, and unbroken. Inside the school, however, the battle was far from over. The Little Rock Nine endured daily taunts, threats, and isolation. Some teachers refused to teach them, classmates whispered insults or turned their backs in the hallways. One student, Minnie Jean Brown, was suspended for defending herself against relentless harassment. Yet, despite the cruelty, they refused to leave. Their very presence challenged generations of inequality, turning their pain into a statement of unshakable determination. Outside Little Rock, segregationists fought back in other ways. Some districts closed schools rather than integrate, leaving thousands of children, black and white alike, without classrooms. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, public schools shut down for 5 years rather than comply with the law. Across the South, textbooks were withheld, teachers were dismissed, and entire systems were manipulated to preserve the old order. Still, the courage of those 9 students changed history. Their actions forced the federal government to confront its own promises and showed the world that progress required more than court rulings, it demanded human bravery. The Little Rock Nine became living proof that young people could stand against an entire system and shift the course of a nation. Years later, when one of them was asked how they endured it all, she answered simply, "We knew it had to be done." Their footsteps into Central High echoed far beyond Arkansas. They became the sound of a new generation refusing to surrender its right to learn, to grow, and to be free. When the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act followed a year later, America seemed to finally turn a page. The signs that once separated water fountains and classrooms began to disappear. The laws that had enforced inequality for nearly a century were struck down. For many, it felt like the dawn of a new era, a long-awaited promise finally fulfilled. Yet history, as it so often does, refused to stay neatly in the past. Though the legal structure of Jim Crow collapsed, its legacy remained etched into the foundations of society. The wounds left by generations of exclusion did not heal overnight. Schools that had once been segregated remained divided by neighborhood and income. Communities built in the shadow of redlining still struggled with limited resources and opportunities. The gap in wealth, education, and housing that had been created under the old system continued to shape lives long after the laws changed. In the decades that followed, a new kind of inequality emerged, less visible, but no less powerful. Policies around housing, employment, and criminal justice carried echoes of the same hierarchy that Jim Crow had once enforced in plain sight. The rise of mass incarceration became one of its clearest legacies. Minor offenses that might once have resulted in fines or warnings now led to years behind bars, disproportionately affecting the same communities that had long been marginalized. In some ways, the system of control simply evolved, finding new forms to survive within the boundaries of modern law. At the same time, barriers to voting reappeared under new names. Strict identification laws, voter roll purges, and reduced polling places in certain districts revived old struggles through the language of legality. Once again, access to the ballot box, a symbol of true citizenship, became a point of contention. Each generation has had to fight to keep open the doors that earlier ones had forced ajar. And yet, the story is not one of defeat. It is a story of persistence. The same spirit that endured the years of segregation continues to push for fairness and equality today. Every protest, every march, every act of civic participation builds on the courage of those who once faced down impossible odds. The road is long, and progress is uneven, but the determination to create a more just society remains alive. The history of Jim Crow is not just about what was done in the past, it is about what must still be done in the present. Remembering it is an act of responsibility, a reminder that freedom is never guaranteed, it must be protected and renewed by every generation. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep history alive, honor the struggles that shaped our world, and ensure that the lessons of the past continue to light the way forward.